SWIFT is a secure messaging system that allows banks to make international payments to each other. The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication is based in Belgium and is the main mechanism for financing international trade. Last year, on average, 42 million transactions a day were processed using fin messages. SWIFT connects 11,000 institutions in more than 200 countries. Russia is the second biggest user of the network, with 300 banks and organisations. Those cut off will need to find an alternative channel to process transactions, which could prove slow, more expensive and less secure. They could use cryptocurrencies or Russia's own network, SPFS, or System for Transfer of Financial Messages, but that's mainly used by organisations inside the country. Alternatively, China is Russia's biggest trade partner, and Moscow could direct its banks to use the Chinese-owned cross-border interbank payment system. But it has enormous limitations. The Rouble has to be converted to yuan, and it only connects 1,280 institutions. So, what if Russia and China decide to go it alone? Can they survive without SWIFT? And could it lead to a recalibration of the global payment system? Strategic affairs analyst Alexey Muraviev says it's too early to tell what impact SWIFT sanctions will have.
Obviously, the Russians have substantial resources that they can now throw at the economy and the financial system to keep the national currency floating, to keep the business going. So it would very much depend on how long these sanctions are going to remain in place. If they're going to be stay for extended period of time, it will probably start hurting the Russian economy more severely than the Russians probably think of. But for the time being, we're in this period of ambiguity.
Could Russia operate successfully, prosperously without SWIFT? Because we know it has been developing an alternative system.
Indeed, it has been developing its alternative system since 2014, after the first line of anti-Russia concerning Ukraine sanctions came into play. But we also need to remember that Russia, and prior to that the Soviet Union, lived and operated under very tight sanctions regime in the past, and every time the Russians worked the way around the system, they would obviously try to find alternative ways how to sneak around. And given the fact that sanctions are not being introduced by the majority of the countries, but by some 30 countries, that gives them opportunity. But during the transition period, obviously the Russians will suffer.
Could there potentially be a realistic tie-up between China and Russia? And if so, what might that mean for the global payment system and I guess a shift away from the traditional system?
Look, I think the China window represents some sort of a breathing space for the Russians right now. And obviously the Russians and the Chinese will try to exploit that window of opportunity, given the fact that their trade is on the rise. It's aimed to hit a $200 billion a year turnover benchmark. So the Russians will certainly try to exploit it. It would very much depend on the position of the Chinese. If the Chinese would try to play really safe, as they did following Russia's annexation of Crimea, because they wouldn't want their banking system to come under sanctions, that it may represent some natural restraint for the Russians. But if the Chinese will want to risk and up their ante, given the current problematic state in China-US, China-West relations, that may actually give more leverage and more freedom of maneuver to the Russians.
Do you think that this could be the beginning of deglobalization?
Well, that's a really interesting question. Certainly from my viewpoint as a national security and strategy expert, I can certainly say that's the beginning of the creation of the new world. And that may, in fact, indeed lead to some sort of, maybe not deglobalization. I would probably say that both the Russians and the Chinese are interested in globalization because they've been working on developing globalized economies. I would probably call it re-globalization. So they're trying to recap the geopolitical map of the world according to that scenario. And I think they will try to reconfigure the geoeconomic global zone in accordance with their understanding of their relationships with other states as well.
Alexey Muraviev, great to talk to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.